This took place in Port Edwards, Wisconsin in 2002. I was 21 at the time, and my belief in the paranormal was non-existent. Whenever I heard stories from other people, I just laughed them off because I never experienced anything like that before. This night would change my view on this subject forever. My girlfriend at the time, along with some friends and I, all went out to a movie and bowling. We were out for about 5 hours and were all exhausted by the end of the night. Our friend and his fiance had an old home that they were doing renovations on for the past 2 years. It was in an old part of town where most of the houses needed a lot of work done. After the movie and bowling, we all went to their house just to hang out and talk. We were there for about an hour when weird things started to happen. While we were all hanging out in the living room, all of a sudden, we heard the faucet in the kitchen turn on. We heard the water hitting the sink, and my girlfriend and I were confused about what was happening at this point. Our friends just looked at us like everything was normal, and one of them walked into the kitchen and turned off the faucet. He walked back into the living room casually and sat back down on the couch. He knew by the expressions on our faces that he needed to explain. He proceeded to tell us that this house was haunted and that weird things have been happening lately. Of course, I didn't believe him whatsoever, and my girlfriend was just plain scared. A little while later, we all decided to build a fire in the backyard. It was early November, and one of the first nights when it was cold enough to wear heavy jackets. After we were out there for 30 minutes, we decided to go back into the house. We put out the fire and started to walk up to the back sliding door when we noticed it was closed and locked. We had been the only ones in the house, and our friends left the door cracked open because everything else was locked and their keys were inside. We were all confused because we knew the door was cracked open 10 minutes before. We were trying to get the door open when things started to get scary. As we were trying to pull the sliding door open, we saw a man walk into the kitchen. A man none of us knew. The kitchen light was off and the living room lights were on, so we couldn't clearly make out what he looked like. We were all stunned and frozen by the sight of this unknown man. The girls screamed and backed away from the door, and my friend and I were yelling at the man to leave the house. All this man did was look at us with what we could see was a blank stare. He was a very tall man with long hair. He had his hands balled up in fists while standing very aggressively toward us. At this point, we had everything riding against us. Our keys and cell phones were all inside, so we couldn't call the police. Then, he suddenly stepped closer to us, almost to the point where his face was touching the glass. He had this smile on his face that I'll never forget. It was a sadistic smile, like this man knew that we were helpless. We told the girls to run back towards where the fire was, because at this point, my girlfriend was about to cry. The terrifying thing that I noticed was that while this man was up close to the glass, his breath wasn't showing up on the glass. This sent chills down my back. After what seemed like about 5 minutes of us staring back at each other, and my friend and I yelling at this man to leave, we decided to break in and get him out. We started to pull harder on the door, and the man suddenly backed away. His eyes opened up very wide, like he was afraid. He quickly turned around and walked into the living room. Right before he left our field of vision, he vanished. I swear up and down this man seemed as real as any of us there. I felt very sick and perplexed. We eventually got the door open and searched the whole house, but no one was there. We were going to call the police, but we all had a feeling that the police could not help in this situation. To this day, I have never been back to that house. Our friends have experienced other things after this, but nothing to this extent. Whatever it is in that house, I don't think it knows where it is. I will never get this man's smile out of my memory. I hesitate to believe in these types of things, but after this incident, I can't deny that there are other things out there that are not explainable.
I was born and brought up in Birmingham, England, before moving to Yorkshire, England, when I was 9 years old. Before I moved to Yorkshire, I lived in a semi-detached house in a suburb to the west of Birmingham. It was very quiet, no heavy traffic. It was lovely. I lived with my parents and my older brother and sister. When I was 19, me and my daughter, who was 2.5 at the time, moved back to Birmingham so that I could undergo a counseling degree. Obviously, since moving up north, we no longer had our old house, so I had to rent a 2-bed house in another suburb close to my old home. It was a nice little house, big open living room, beautiful views from the upstairs windows, nice big bedrooms. It was perfect for me and my daughter. So we moved into the house. My daughter was very happy and settled quite quickly. The first night we spent there, everything was fine. My daughter went to bed, so I decided to stay downstairs and watch some DVDs while eating a takeaway. Time went by, and seeing as I was at university the next day, I went to bed. The next morning, I did the standard procedures of any mom. I gave my daughter breakfast, got her dressed, etc. Then took her around to my auntie's house, who still lived in Birmingham and was a registered childminder. Once I dropped my daughter off at my aunt's house, I returned to my house where I turned the heating down to 20 degrees. It was the end of the year, getting cold, but not cold enough to have the heating on full. I gathered my books and left, locking the door behind me. At 5 p.m., I left university, picked up my daughter, and drove back to the house. When I pulled up, I went around the car to get my daughter out of the back seat. Once she was out, I locked the car, and for some reason, I looked up at the house and was drawn to my bedroom window where I could see my curtains moving. It was strange because the house was fairly new with double glazed windows, so it couldn't have been a draft. And the curtains were heavy, but I did have the bathroom window open that morning, so I assumed it was just the breeze from that. Once inside the house, it was incredibly cold. 20 degrees on the thermostat is enough to kick the central heating on and keep a stable temperature in the house. But again, I assumed it was because I had left the bathroom window open. I left my daughter in the living room and went upstairs into the bathroom. The window was closed and locked. I went back downstairs and checked the thermostat. It had turned completely off. The only reason a thermostat would do that is if it was faulty, I had done it myself, or the temperature of the house went above that of what I set it to. None of this happened. After what felt like hours of trying to warm up, we had tea and I got my daughter bathed and into bed. She drifted off fairly quickly, which was normal, and I returned downstairs to get on with an essay. About an hour later, I heard my daughter screaming. I went upstairs assuming she had maybe fallen out of bed or just had a nightmare, but when I got to her room, she was stood up at the end of her bed with her arms out to me. This wasn't because of a nightmare. She was literally beside herself. Of course, any parent would know that trying to get sense out of a 2-year-old isn't easy, so I sat on bed with her on my lap, asking what was wrong. Through the tears, she pointed to the corner of her bedroom. I looked over and all that was there was a chest of drawers and a bin. I looked back at her and she was staring at this corner of the room. I asked her, "What are you looking at, sweetie?" And she said, "Man." I was a bit puzzled by it, but I just put it down to her having a really horrible nightmare. She was still inconsolable, so I brought her downstairs and laid her on the settee with her quilt while I sat in the recliner next to it. I got my head back into a book and carried on with my essay while watching some random comedy on the TV. My daughter was sound asleep within minutes. I had obviously drifted off because I remember being woken up by this almighty smell of whiskey. It was so pungent that it was like someone had poured bottles of it all over the living room carpet. I do drink alcohol, but I never touch whiskey, and I had none in the house whatsoever. In fact, I had no spirits at all. It got to the point where it was starting to make me feel really sick. But then, just like that, after a few minutes, the smell completely vanished. By this point, I was getting a bit concerned because generally I'm a skeptic and not easily spooked, but something was definitely going on in that house. I relaxed back into the recliner and went onto the internet. Please don't ask me why I did what I did next because I really don't know for sure. I think my fascination got the better of me, but I am a big fan of a British TV series called Most Haunted, where a group of ghost hunters investigates supposedly haunted buildings. And one of the methods they use to determine whether there is a ghost is to draw around an object on a piece of paper and leave it there, and you return later on to see if the object had moved outside of the outline. Now, I know it's crazy, and again, being a skeptic, it still surprises me that I thought about doing this, but I went into the kitchen and grabbed my purse. I placed 5 coins on a piece of paper and drew around them, and left it all on the dining table. I scooped up my daughter and put her in my bed with me. I fell asleep instantly. The next morning, my daughter didn't remember anything about the previous night, but I remembered the smell of whiskey, so I knew I wasn't dreaming the whole thing. But we got up, dressed, etc., and left the house, but I had forgotten about the coins, not expecting anything to have happened with them, obviously. Oh, how wrong I was. We returned that afternoon about 3 p.m. We'd done a food shop, so I was unloading all the food shopping while my daughter was in her buggy in the hallway. With my first load of shopping, I walked through the open living area, and to get to the kitchen, you have to walk through the dining room. I looked at the table with the piece of paper and the coins, and I dropped my shopping bag when I saw it. All 5 coins had moved out of the outlines, some more than others. Now, I will point out my daughter didn't know about this. She didn't see it and she didn't know it was there, so she couldn't have possibly moved them. By this point, my heart leapt into my throat and I felt really faint. I left the shopping bags and went to get my daughter. And when I saw her, she had her eyes fixated on the top of the stairway. Even when I called her name, she didn't acknowledge me. I looked up the stairs and saw nothing. I turned my head and asked my daughter, "What are you looking up there?" And she said, "Man." Again, my heart jumped into my throat. I looked up the stairs again, and I heard this almighty crashing, as if something had been dropped from the top of the stairs and was bouncing down each step to the bottom. I grabbed my daughter and got us into the car and drove over to my aunt's house. I didn't even lock the house. By the time I got to my aunt's house, I was a complete wreck. I thought I was losing my mind, or I was just so exhausted from work and studies that I'd literally drained myself and started hallucinating or something. But my aunt is a believer in the paranormal world and told me that if I suspect something is wrong in the house, then I should find out. I couldn't believe what I was hearing, but because I was so hyped up, I just agreed. As it happens, one of my mom's friends is an exorcist, and she lived on the other side of Birmingham. My aunt rang my mom in Yorkshire and asked for his number, but didn't say why. After a few hours of calming down and drinking no end of black coffee, I finally came to my senses and realized I was being totally ridiculous, and my daughter was just being silly like kids usually are. But my aunt was adamant that I go with Martin the exorcist to the house and find out what was going on there. I agreed out of respect for her, but I insisted that my daughter stay with her. With that, she insisted that we stay the night at her house and asked for my house key so she could lock up. The next day, Martin arrived at my aunt's house, and he was just like I remembered him. To look at him, you would think he was some high-end financial banker the way he was dressed. But he was just a down-to-earth bloke. It was hard to believe that he exorcised houses and demons. Of course, I was a non-believer and all that, but he was a family friend, and that was what I saw him as, so I had to give him the benefit of the doubt. He took me into the kitchen where he asked me what had been happening to me. I explained to him about my daughter saying "man" when there was no one there. The temperature drop, the smell of whiskey, the coins, and the crashing noise on the stairs. He was very, very sympathetic towards me and said that in order to establish what was going on in the house, I would have to accompany him to the house. A part of me was apprehensive as hell, but then reality sunk in and I realized I had nothing to be scared of. It was a nice house in a nice area, and I was probably just overtired from all the work I'd been doing. We got to the house, and before we set foot in the door, Martin stood dead in his tracks and looked up at my bedroom window. I didn't say anything. Remember, I saw curtains moving. He looked away and we headed inside, closing the door behind us. Again, the house was unnaturally cold. There was no reason for it to be, unless all the windows had been left open overnight, which they weren't. I remember so vividly Martin carrying a Bible in a small purple cloth. That purple cloth seemed to have no purpose. It just looked like a hanky. God, it still scares me thinking about it. Anyway, Martin stood in the hallway looking around when he asked me where all the phenomena happened. I first showed him upstairs to my daughter's room. He sat on the bed while I perched myself up against the wall near the window. I was staring at him while he just sat there looking around the room. He was so quiet, and it got to the point where I said, "Martin, there's nothing here." And just as I finished that sentence, he stood up and looked at the corner of the room where my daughter stared into. I can't forget the look on his face when he did that. And I don't want to talk about it because it makes me feel so ill at ease. He looked at me and, clear as day, he said he's a bad soul. He said nothing else and summoned me to follow him downstairs. We entered the living room. I sat in the recliner again while Martin paced around the room, touching the walls very gently with his fingertips. I didn't question it. I just left him to it. By this point, thinking, bloody hell, here we go. We stopped dead at the dining table where he saw the coins on the piece of paper. He asked me if I had set this up, and of course I replied yes. He retaliated by saying, "This has angered him. He thinks you're making him look like a fool, and he doesn't appreciate it." I got really pissed off by this point and told Martin that I am a skeptic, and I'm not in the mood for games. I just want to know what the hell is going on. I felt kind of bad for getting edgy with him, but I was so fed up of it all. He sat down on the sofa and put his Bible in purple cloth on the footrest in front of him and asked me very bluntly, "Katie, I know you're a non-believer, but what you've been experiencing is not your imagination or exhaustion." I sat there and rolled my eyes like you do. Then, what he did next absolutely terrified me to the point where I could have had a heart attack. I was that frightened. Martin asked for a pen and paper. I pulled out a notepad and pen that I always carried around with me in my handbag and handed it to him. He picked up the pen and started drawing while talking to me at the same time. He began to draw a series of circles with what I can only describe as flowers in the middle of them. While drawing, he said, "This is what the soul is showing me. Does it mean anything to you?" I sat next to Martin and had a look at the picture once he had finished. I picked up the paper and stared at it for a few seconds. Then suddenly, I realized it was a similar pattern that was on a ball I used to have when I was little. I used to go out in the garden and throw it against the garage wall. It was one of the few things I could remember of my childhood. Anyway, I told Martin that I did recognize the pattern, but what about it? And he said, "The soul in this house did not like this object." Just then, as if lightning had struck me, I remember when we lived in Birmingham when I was younger. We had a neighbor named Jack Morris. He was a man in his 60s and lived alone. He wasn't friendly at all and always complained about something to do with one of the neighbors even if they did nothing wrong. And another thing I remember about him was he sewed his curtains shut in the front and back windows. Now, this is what scares me, and I'd completely forgotten this had happened until I saw this picture. I was outside with my brother and sister playing with this ball when I accidentally kicked it over the dividing hedge between our house and Jack's. He went around to retrieve the ball, and when we asked him if we could have it back, he got right into mine and my brother's face and swore at us. Some words that no child my age should have heard, and I could smell Scotch whiskey on his breath when he shouted at us. I never got my ball back. By then, I was shaking like a leaf, and it felt like I was having a panic attack. Martin comforted me and said he would rid the house of this negative energy, but to do this, he wanted me to go outside. I left the house and stood by the car and had a cigarette in the hope that it would calm me down. I really was a complete wreck. After Martin had finished, he left the house and tried to talk to me, but I just couldn't speak. I think the shock of what had just happened and the flashbacks rendered me speechless. Martin drove us back to my aunt's house where my aunt was waiting with my daughter. I sat in the living room and remember staring at the floor and refusing to talk to anyone, totally unlike me. About an hour later, Martin and my aunt sat with me and I finally spoke and asked, "What just happened? Am I going mad?" I laugh about it now because it sounds so crazy that I asked an exorcist that question, but like I said, he is first and foremost a family friend. Martin was very patient and explained to me that he had cleansed the house of Jack Morris, but this wasn't enough for me. I wanted to know why he was there and what he wanted from me. Again, Martin was incredibly patient with me and explained things to me. Jack was a loner, and although he didn't know this, when we lived in our old house, he had a deep hatred of me and my brother and sister, but particularly with me because his wife had left him a few years previously, and they never had children as much as he did want them. He sunk into a deep depression and turned to alcohol, whiskey to be precise. After we moved to Yorkshire, Jack was blind drunk and fell from the top of the stairs where he died instantly from a broken neck. Although I was shocked by what I heard, it still didn't answer my question of why he was there in that house that was a good 4 miles away from our old house. So I asked Martin again, why was he there? Martin told me that when I had returned to the old house, when I went back to Birmingham, which I did because I just wanted to see it again, Jack was grounded in the house next door, and he followed me to the new house where he regrounded himself into the fabric of the building. He basically held a grudge against me because of the ball incident, and simply because at the time I was a child that he never had. He hated our family so much for it, but his hate was generated towards me because I was such a happy child, and he wanted that so much for himself. And my daughter did indeed see him in the corner of her room that night. He was watching over her, which makes me shudder at the thought of it, even now. And when she saw him at the top of my staircase, which then followed by the crashing sound, it was him replaying his death to my daughter. I didn't return to the house, even though it had been cleansed. It was too much for me, so my aunt and her partner cleared everything out for me, and I decided to move back to Yorkshire and continue my studies there. I explained what had just happened to my mom, and she was just flabbergasted by the whole thing. And like me, my mom is an avid skeptic, but even this made her question things. I was a small child when I lived in that house. I remember very little of my childhood, unless someone reminds me of it. But neither my parents nor my brother or sister told me of Jack Morris that lived next door, and I had completely forgotten about him until Martin drew that picture for me. The whole experience has left me questioning my belief in the paranormal world. Admittedly, what happened to me is enough to make anyone believe, but I am still unsure. What happened at that house was real, and I do not lie. If Mr. Morris did decide to haunt me and replay his death to my daughter, then it proves that he was a bastard in life as well as death. It's something that will stay with me for life. I'm just glad my daughter was too young at the time to remember it.
I've played with the Ouija boards more than a few times when I was younger. I thought I was interested in all things occult. I spoke to many different entities or spirits throughout the years with some scary experiences sprinkled in there. But the one that sticks out the most is probably the one of the few times I played right before getting rid of it. I've been playing with this board for years at this point. I used to love to bring it out and showcase it in front of any skeptic. I used to ask questions that no one but that person could know the answer to, in order to prove I wasn't moving it. There was even an entity that would communicate with me often in the house I grew up in. He described following me around, or having opinions on things that happened to me, or friends I'd start hanging out with or bringing over. So at this point, you can imagine, I felt a false sense of security in the fact that I've been able to play the Ouija board and handle whatever it comes with. It's Friday night. One of my best friends, David, wants to spend the night. We are somewhere around 8th or 9th grade. My mom had just moved us out of our childhood home and into a trailer with her new boyfriend, so it's one of the first times playing here. We watched a scary movie, The Others, that night, ate junk food, and ended up passing out, as we weren't getting a whole lot of movement in the Ouija. The next morning we woke up to some howling wind in an empty house. I figured my mom had just gone out to the store or something. We realized at some point the power is out. Don't think much of it, since it's extremely windy outside. This is before the days of cell phones, so we have a digital clock powered by battery, and that's it. My home phone was down because of the power. No worries, it's bright outside. We have light, food, and we're sure the power will be back any moment. So we proceed to eat the food in the fridge before it goes bad and decide to bring out the Ouija since there's nothing else to do. Can we play? That's always the first question to start the game. The planchette quickly moves to yes. At this point, we begin to ask the questions. Where did my mom go? Ouija board says, store. What time will she be back? Ouija board says, 11:23. It's only answering my questions, but not David's. I ask why. It spells out, bitch. At this point, it starts spelling out bitch over and over again. I felt like it was too aggressive, so I tried to end the game by rubbing over the goodbye sign and putting it back in the box. This wasn't the first time we ever encountered aggression, so we continued to hang out, eating and laughing. Then we hear the outer back door swing open. No one comes in. We look at the digital clock and it's 11:23. Oh shit, it's the exact time. I turn to David in disbelief. My mom must have groceries. Let's go help her bring them in. We go outside and the carport is empty. No one is home. Weird, but okay, that was a coincidence, and I chalk it up to the doors on the trailer being too light, and the wind must have opened it. I lock the door and return inside to finish eating my cereal. Maybe 5 seconds pass, and the door swings open again. At this point, I'm a little scared, but trying to explain it away with the wind. I tell David to come with me to close the door and lock it, so I make sure I do it right this time. We do. We return to eating and talking. Now the door swings open again, and we both had seen me use the big lock. There's a tiny room for laundry with an outer back door and another door to get into the rest of the trailer. At this point, the outer door and the main door both start swinging open and close violently and fast. I'm frozen. Once both doors are swinging, everything in the fridge and on the counter start flying off. Papers from the fridge are literally flying around the room. It was like a scene out of The Exorcist. At this point, it's non-stop. It felt loud and chaotic, and I felt a feeling of absolute terror. I ran for the couch like a little kid. We hid under the blanket from last night, crouched together, scared. I was watching it, and it seemed surreal. I grew up Catholic, although my family didn't go to church anymore. The only prayer I could think of was the Our Father, so I started basically chanting it over and over, and then after about a minute or so, all of a sudden it stops. The paper from the fridge fall to the ground, the door is slammed shut, everything stops flying around and it's quiet. I find out later my mom was never at the store. She picked up an extra shift at work that Saturday. There is no meaning or significance behind the exact time it gave me, except for when it started to harass us. I've had many experiences with the Ouija board. Weird little things that happened. Starting to see entities in your home after using it. Things being moved. Feeling of not being alone in a room. Prophecies of the age of my death. Through my experiences, I can say the Ouija is dangerous. Whatever you speak to mixes in lies with truth when answering. They know more about what's happened than what will happen in the future. Luckily, I was never possessed or anything like that, but I believe that has to do more with a weak mind. Just my belief. I can say I do think I opened the door to things following me or being around me as I moved around as an adult. They are never quite gone completely, but it's not near as frightening for me now, because I have faith, and that's what keeps me grounded. A faith that sprouted from that day